Well, it's kind of the passing of an era, I guess. Our era is passing kind of rapidly right now. We've lost so many in the last few months and few years with the...
For almost 6 decades, Bill Anderson was the quiet, reverent voice of tradition in country music's most holy rooms. But at 87, the Grand Ole Opry icon has finally chosen to break his silence, and he isn't holding back. In a jaw-dropping interview at the Country Music Hall of Fame, Anderson delivered a rare, scorching indictment of how country music lost its character. What he disclosed was more than just altering patterns. It was also about betrayal. 5 names, 5 artists. All are connected to the Opry, and in his opinion, each one contributed to the demise of a genre that he had spent his whole life developing. Bill Anderson started with disappointment rather than insults. His initial aim was none other than Kenny Rogers, whom he previously adored. However, this does not justify what Bill considers to be one of the first betrayals of genuine national principles. Rogers, with his smooth voice and crossover appeal, ushered in an age when country music was glamorized and dressed up in pop production. The turning point, according to Bill, came with singles like Lady and the legendary duet Islands in the Stream. They were polished, emotive displays with broad appeal. Anderson stated that the transition was not quick, but once it began, there was no turning back. Record labels started seeking the easy listening sound. Storytelling, long the heart of country music, was buried beneath synthesizers and soft-focus ballads. Anderson recognized Rogers' brilliance, but questioned the cost, a genre that was gradually straying away from its front porch roots and toward a sound more appropriate for shopping malls than the Opry. It wasn't just Kenny, it was the ripple effect that followed. Every success Rogers had in the pop country genre emboldened executives to value glamour above substance. According to Bill, that's when country music ceased being about real experiences and became about radio formulae, and the authenticity of country music suffered as a result. The devastation did not end with sound. Bill Anderson feels that the true breakdown occurred when picture became more important than story. Kenny Rogers was a symbol of metamorphosis, a guy who rose from humble origins to a polished superstar. However, the unintended impact was to make the country feel like a product. Anderson noted that once upon a time, a country song did not require a high-budget music video or a gorgeous album cover. It only needed the truth. That was altered in the early 1980s. Rogers' enormous popularity sparked a new breed of industry strategists who were more concerned with market demographics than artistic foundations. This move began to affect artist expectations. Country performers were now expected to appeal to urban audiences, Billboard charts, and crossover radio. The spirit of the country, rural suffering, working-class pride, and heartbreak, all stated simply, became diluted. Anderson was not angry about Rogers' achievement. What happened next was painful. A generation of artists no longer regarded storytelling as a holy responsibility. Instead, they were taught to write universal hits, which generally meant removing the nuances that made country music appealing in the first place. To Bill, it was never just about one artist. It was about how the system mass-produced Kenny's model, erasing the genre's cultural character in the process. Bill Anderson did not hesitate to mention Garth Brooks next. Where Rogers altered the sound, Brooks affected the scale, and not in a way that Anderson enjoyed. According to him, Garth's emergence in the 1990s marked the end of country music's closeness. Once defined by acoustic ballads and porch-light confessions, the genre has now found itself in stadiums crowded with fireworks, smoke machines, and wire harnesses. Anderson wasn't denigrating Brooks's abilities. Rather, he readily said Garth was one of the most electric performers he'd ever seen. But what worried him was the dramatic transformation that came with it. The music became background noise for a grander spectacle. Anderson recalled how country fans used to sit silently, absorbing every word. Now they were yelling above the fireworks. He questioned what remained of the artist-audience connection when events resembled rock concerts more than anything. Bill was not mourning progress. He was grieving its cost. Country music had abandoned its roots in order to appeal to a larger audience. Intimacy was replaced with immersion. Emotion was sacrificed for energy, and somewhere amid the din, the delicate drawl of a steel guitar and the cracked voice of a forlorn vocalist were drowned out. The actual loss, according to Anderson, was country music's capacity to whisper truth rather than yell spectacle. Bill Anderson was particularly troubled by the rippling effect Garth Brooks's performances generated. When Brooks made country music profitable on a stadium scale, record execs saw the model and wanted replication. Suddenly, authenticity was more than just a choice. It was inconvenient. The front porch, barroom, and radio truck beds of old country were replaced by sound stages, rigging systems, and multi-million-dollar stage designs. Anderson saw a cultural change in which younger artists were no longer expected to write from experience, but instead act from a script. He recalled being backstage at the Opry, observing practices that resembled dress rehearsals for Broadway rather than sound checks for country songs. Songs were losing importance in favor of stagecraft. The genre was not only developing, it was morphing. To Bill, the core of the nation was more than simply stories. It was silence, a quiet melody, a broken voice, and a moment of truth. These instances were increasingly rare throughout the Garth Brooks era. Even artists who did not wish to join the trend felt forced to stay competitive. Were you even marketable if you weren't selling out arenas or soaring over crowds? That question tormented Bill Anderson, which is why he cited Brooks as a turning moment, not for who he was, but for what he left behind in the industry. When Bill Anderson referenced Taylor Swift, he did it without anger, but also without appreciation. In his perspective, she represented a new type of disruption. She did not simply modify country music, she exploited and then abandoned it. Anderson admired her songwriting abilities, particularly in her early years, but her quick transition from country darling to pop behemoth left a sour taste. Bill's concern was not just that she had left the genre, but also how. Swift's departure felt like a declaration that the country was only a launching pad, not a destination, and he saw this as undermining all the genre stood for. The Grand Ole Opry was formerly a place of lifetime commitment. It was now only a momentary halt on the way to superstardom. Anderson appreciated ambition, but questioned devotion. He recalls a period when musicians dedicated their entire lives to country music, whether they were famous or not. Swift's leaving, whether planned or not, demonstrated to a younger generation that nation does not have to be home. It may simply be a phase. Bill was concerned about the message it conveyed, that country music was a stepping stone for the skilled, not a final resting place for the dedicated. And with each mainstream crossover, it appeared that the genre's origins became weaker and more forgettable. Anderson's remarks were harsher when he mentioned Jason Aldean. Unlike Rodgers, Brooks, and Swift, who had an influence through growth or departure, Aldean, according to Bill, helped hollow out the nation from inside. Anderson saw the bro country era, which Aldean popularized, as a cultural breakdown rather than a fleeting phase. There were no more songs about hardship, loss, or family. Instead, beer labels, lifted trucks, and sanitized party tunes have taken over country music. Bill felt as if the genre's emotional lexicon had been marked with a black marker. Aldean's chart-topping songs were not without enthusiasm, but they lacked impact. Anderson pointed out that the stories being presented were actually lists of buzzwords placed over guitar loops. Dirt Road Anthem, for example, glorified rural life without addressing its harsh realities. There were no moms, lost loves, or regrets, only a tailgate and a drink. Bill wasn't anti-fun, but he was against the erasing of grief, complexity, and depth. He regarded bro country as a symptom of an industry seeking to appeal to a younger clientele while losing sight of its elder roots. As the genre shifted toward surface-level celebration, it lost touch with the raw, emotional truth that made it so effective in the first place. Anderson viewed degradation in Aldean, rather than innovation, as a steady destruction of what he had previously believed. The true hurt for Bill Anderson wasn't the content of bro country, but how fast it became the standard. What began as a niche sound with performers such as Jason Aldean quickly grew into a dominant force that impacted playlists, tours, and the whole image of modern country. It wasn't enough to be a great writer or a sincere vocalist. You had to look a certain way, sing about specific topics, and fit the mold. Authenticity was no longer determined by how authentic a music felt, but rather by how effectively it followed the trend. Anderson saw how young, bright artists were pushed into this formula. Their original music, which was frequently steeped in folk, blues, and sometimes gospel, was gradually replaced by songs with pre-approved hooks and superficial imagery. He saw how industry officials grew to associate artistic integrity with financial risk, favoring safer, more marketable songs. To Anderson, this was a violation of what country music has always promised: truth. Songs such as "He Stopped Loving Her Today" and "I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry" helped define the genre. Now, songs about rural roads and red Solo cups ruled the charts. And although the audience was dancing, Bill felt they were also forgetting. Ignore the misery, forgetting the fight, forgetting that country music used to be about more than just a lifestyle. For him, forgetting was inexcusable. Anderson's tone changed from irritation to fatigue as he turned to face Morgan Wallen. He didn't reject Wallen's skill. Rather, he recognized the budding star's innate abilities and musical sensibilities. However, Bill contended that skill alone was insufficient to shoulder the weight of country music's history. What worried him was everything about Wallen: the controversies, the headlines, the scandals. In Anderson's opinion, Wallen symbolized a new generation of artists whose public personalities threatened to eclipse their talent. The issue was not simply terrible behavior, but how country music had become accustomed to it. Once upon a time, the Opry and its members fought hard to gain international recognition for the genre. That regard seems to have been damaged. Wallen's name was associated with events unrelated to music, yet characterized his presence in the genre. Anderson was concerned about the message this might send, not only to fans, but also to future artists. What does the spotlight's reward for chaos over art indicate about the ideals of country music? For Bill, country music should be a genre of integrity, where the artist's character is as important as their chart position. He did not call for Wallen's banishment, but he did advocate for responsibility. Anderson feared that when controversy became louder than song, the music itself would fade into silence. Bill Anderson's thoughts were more introspective, revealing sadness rather than animosity. For him, the crisis in country music was more than just oral or stylistic. It was spiritual. The genre had previously represented something lasting. It was never simply music. It was a reflection of the human experience, conveying stories of love, sorrow, family, faith, and adversity with such raw honesty that it hurt. But suddenly, Bill witnessed a genre at odds with its own past. He recalled how holy tradition was at the Grand Ole Opry, where he had spent the most of his life. The wooden circle on the platform was more than simply a symbol. It represented a promise, a pledge that authenticity was important, that every artist who stood there understood where they came from and what the music meant. Today, he feared the promise would be breached. The country was not just developing, it was also fragmenting, trying to suit every demographic while losing sight of the core audience that had always kept it alive. Younger listeners were exposed to a form of country music that lacked storytelling force. They didn't hear the painful restraint of a George Jones song or Chris Christopherson's lyricism. They heard formula, sparkle, and familiarity. For Bill, this was about preservation more than nostalgia. He rejected the contemporary country not because it was new, but because it was hollow. When controversy, trend chasing, and image took precedence above songwriting and spirit, something important was lost. His appeal was simple but urgent. Don't let country music forget what it was founded on. Because when a genre loses touch with its roots, it ceases to evolve. It transforms into something quite different. And according to Bill Anderson, that was a sorrow too silent to be heard until someone spoke up and reminded us of what it truly meant to be a country. Bill Anderson's last statements were not just critical, but also challenging. Not to take down, but to awaken. He made it obvious that the 5 names he mentioned, Rogers, Brooks, Swift, Aldean, and Wallen were not villains. They were exceptional, game-changing artists in their own right. However, each had contributed in their own way to the demise of country music's essential ideals, and it was not about maintaining genre purity or opposing development. It was about keeping your heart intact while going forward. Anderson wanted a compass, not a museum. He constantly addressed the question, what is country music for? Is it simply a commercial product to be molded and sold? Is it still a conduit of truth? If it's the latter, the truth won't last if it's continuously polished, packaged, or overshadowed by headlines. He advised artists, particularly burgeoning stars, not to mix fame with contentment. A viral song is not the same as a timeless song. A sold-out stadium is not the same as a quiet listener sobbing on their porch. Anderson asked the business to slow down, listen, and respect the stillness between sounds, understanding that storytelling was more than simply an old-fashioned concept. It was the country's lifeblood. Without it, everything else, including production, persona, and popularity, was simply noise. He closed on a hopeful note rather than an angry one. I hope that someone out there, perhaps a composer in a tiny town or a performer with dirt on their boots, would carry the flame forward with care. Country music does not need to be saved from outsiders. Rather, it must be remembered from within. And as long as someone is prepared to voice the truth into a microphone, the country has a chance of returning home. Bill Anderson didn't identify names to incite a conflict. He did it to begin a reckoning. Whether or not you agree with him, one thing is certain. He still believes in country music and is willing to battle for it. In an industry concerned with trends, his voice serves as a reminder of what has been lost and what remains worth protecting. As arguments boil online and people select sides, Bill's message stands out. Country music does not require more stars. It needs more soul. And just maybe, someone out there is listening, because Whisperin' Bill may be quiet, but his words are tremendous.